As this episode comes out, you've probably been hearing and reading about Israel's attack on Hamas leaders in Doha, Qatar. Coming up, I'll tell you how the initial coverage has been blowing it and how that is exemplified by profound hypocrisy from the United Nations. While that war is getting a lot of attention, you probably have not heard about this, a giant and grim milestone in Russia's war on Ukraine. It involves how many people have been killed. Way more than in the fighting between Israel and Gaza. Today, I'm going to take you inside that reporting so you can see something that might be surprising. An example of a news agency doing something right. The media can report accurately when it wants to and freely chooses not to when it doesn't want to. You'll also hear how journalists are allowed to describe Vladimir Putin in ways that they do not describe, for example, Islamist terrorists. Meanwhile, an organization representing journalists around the world, an organization the media loves, just created a propaganda campaign. A bunch of news agencies took part in it, and the rest refused to call the campaign what it was. Today, we'll look at times the media acknowledges what propaganda is and when it suddenly reverses course and takes part in propaganda. You'll hear one of the biggest news agencies freak out about the possibility of propaganda spreading on Twitter while that same news agency spread that same propaganda. Yes, really. And speaking of all that, ahead you'll hear how an Arab government correctly called an attack in Jerusalem terrorism, but the media did not. I'll talk you through some headlines from big news agencies about incidents all over the world that prove the media does not follow its own supposed rule. Also today, tying up some loose ends from previous episodes. One involves jury selection and what it says about today's journalism. Another involves a survey of Americans during wartime. Plus, something we can do about the national debt. Actually, while you listen, check out the show notes for a link about that. Unless you're driving, of course, or operating other heavy machinery. All that and more coming up on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. So great to have you here. I want to thank everyone who has been joining this show. I see that each week we get more and more people. It means so much. Mainstream media is such a disaster. This show is about clearing out all the noise and getting you the truth. If you're new, hi, I'm Josh Lebs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact-checks the news. I spent 20 years in mainstream media, 10 on NPR, 10 on CNN, where I became lead on-air fact-checker. But I've always known throughout all that time, and especially today, that what desperately needs fact-checking is the media itself. I launched this show independently. It is entirely supported by listeners like you. And I want to thank those of you who are rating and reviewing it on the platforms. Let's see. The latest one here on Apple Podcasts is from RJ. It says, "This is the most important podcast in a person's queue." Wow. If they truly want to understand how media craft narratives that are false, Josh is fair, factual, and even-handed. I often listen in frustration as he peels away the lies and misinformation. I devour every new episode and even revisit those I've played. Just a vital podcast if we want to keep the MSM, mainstream media, honest, or if we are interested in the truth. Wow. RJ, thank you so much. Also, I have discovered that I'm supposed to be looking at this stuff on Spotify that I hadn't realized. On Spotify, those of you who listen there, you can weigh in on individual episodes and put comments there. Here's one from Lori on an episode I did about media attacks on Senator John Fetterman. She wrote, "No one other than a licensed clinical professional should attempt to diagnose or assess mental health functioning." Not only are the quote-unquote progressives going after him, undermining a population they supposedly support, that is, folks with mental health struggles, they're doing so outside the scope of their professional capacity. Yes, they are. If you have not heard that episode, just scroll back in your queue and you will see the episode on Fetterman. All right, I'm going to start off today with a couple of loose ends. I've been wanting to bring this to you, but I always try to keep the episodes limited to about half an hour. I so appreciate your time. So they kept not fitting into the previous one. But here goes. I reported on how Ronan Farrow who ridiculously became this media darling, blew it in fact-checking in so many ways in his book. I mentioned also that Farrow said on Twitter when the Harvey Weinstein trial was happening that nearly 50 jurors had to be excused because they had read his book, and the New York Times said it was only 2. I always like to get my own confirmation of this stuff. So the very nice man who handled all these records for so many years and still has them, he got back from a vacation and went straight to looking at this for me. And he said, yes, there were only 2 or maximum 3 jurors who had to be let go because of the book. This might sound like minutia, but it isn't. It matters. When any journalist makes a claim that is false and just leaves it up there and doesn't care and then stands by it when someone calls it out, there's no reason for you to trust that journalist or any news outlet that publishes that journalist. If you get something wrong, just correct it. Say so. There's nothing shameful if you made the good faith effort in the first place. But that's the key, making that good faith effort. Speaking of that, I always invite you all to send in any comments and questions. And you can tell me if I got anything wrong. I would love to do segments here called I Stand Corrected. Your comments are amazing, obviously. So far, I have not gotten corrections, but I go back and look at my own stuff anyway and then try to check for things. And I found one a couple episodes ago when I was talking about the disastrous New York Times Ezra Klein. I mentioned a survey of Americans during the war with Afghanistan, showing that Americans were not overly concerned about the conditions faced by civilians in Afghanistan. I had said that was from 2003. I double-checked it. It was originally from late 2001. And I'm telling you, see, it's not that hard. All right. Speaking of war, let's talk about the breaking news. As I record this, there's reporting that Israel has attacked Hamas leaders in Doha, Qatar, people who were behind the October 7th massacres. When the media is covering this, the first reference that should come to mind for them is bin Laden. But that, so far, has not been happening. Here's what we're seeing instead. It's exemplified by the United Nations. Reuters just came out with this report in which UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres condemned these strikes as a, quote, flagrant violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Qatar. Well, when the United States killed bin Laden and several other people, including family members of his, in that raid, that was every bit as much a violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Pakistan. But so far, no one is pointing this out in the big mainstream media. I went back and looked at what the UN Secretary General said after that happened. It was Ban Ki-moon. He called it a watershed moment in our common global fight against terrorism. All this is breaking, and I'm going to keep an eye on it and let you know in the coming days through my newsletter and Instagram and in the next episode just how well or how poorly the media does on this. But while the world is freaking out about that story, here's something that's getting buried. The incomparably huger death toll in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Here is a recent report from the New York Times, which shows that when it wants to, it can actually follow basic rules of journalism.
Nearly 1 million Russian troops have been killed or wounded in the country's war against Ukraine, according to a new study. The study, by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, said that close to 400,000 Ukrainian troops have also been killed or wounded since the war began. Officials caution that casualty figures were difficult to estimate because Moscow is believed to routinely undercount its war dead and injured, and Kyiv does not disclose official figures. The study relied on casualty figures from American and British government estimates, among other sources.
You know what all that was? Context. Here's what a group is saying. Here's where it's getting its figures from. Here's what we don't know. And this article did not lead with figures of people killed. What you heard there was it grouping together killed and wounded. You have to go further down into the article to even get estimated death figures.
The center put the number of Russian troop deaths at close to 250,000 since President Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion in February 2022. The study said that between 60,000 and 100,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed.
Context, context, context. Now, how does the New York Times, like the rest of the media, discuss alleged casualty figures from Gaza? Here's the New York Times again. There's so many examples of this, but let's go with good old Ezra Klein.
The death count is above 50,000 people, more than 15,000 of whom are children.
That's all, just like it's a fact. No context, no sources, no anything. No mention that it's impossible to know because all the figures come from Hamas, a terrorist group. No mention that Hamas has repeatedly changed its own figures, even going back and lowering the alleged number of women and children. No mention that Hamas counts teenage terrorists as children and has a long history of counting people over age 18 as children for propaganda. No mention of studies showing that the figures don't make sense. No mention that this includes people killed by Hamas and other terrorist groups in Gaza. No mention that Hamas refuses to call any of them combatants and terrorists. The only estimates on that are from Israel. And just as the New York Times cited British and American counts just now, the New York Times should cite the only source available on how many are combatants. In this case, the figures from Israel. That would be journalism, providing that and saying where they got it from. Who knows? Maybe reporting accurately like that might actually pressure Hamas to start trying to give figures of combatants. I've mentioned before that in order to analyze the media, we need to think like a rational alien. Like you just got to Earth and you see this species does this to communicate about that place, but this whole other thing to communicate about that place? What are humans doing? Let's lighten things up for a second. Where's that sound effect called cute alien? There it is. But that's just the beginning. In the New York Times piece, you heard the words, since Putin ordered the invasion. The Times and other big media regularly establish how that war started. Russia invaded Ukraine, just as Hamas and other Gazan terrorists invaded Israel. And President Vladimir Zelensky himself has called on the world to support Israel, saying Israel, like Ukraine, was attacked by those who oppose democracy and want to destroy their countries. It's not just the New York Times. Here's NBC.
This 3.5-year war led by President Putin.
They have no problem reminding everyone constantly who launched that war. And listen to how journalists are allowed to describe Putin. Here is Jake Tapper on CNN.
People who are praising Vladimir Putin, who is a murderous thug.
Can you even imagine CNN describing Hamas leaders that way? Or leaders of other Iran-backed terrorist groups in the Middle East? Like the Houthis' self-declared prime minister who Israel managed to kill in an attack the other day? Or the head of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ali Khamenei, who leads Death to America chants and keeps trying to kill as many civilians as possible in Israel. I was there, hiding in shelters from bombs being rained on us by Iran. The same standards and practices are supposed to apply always. And just as journalists should be fighting for democracy, they should be listening to democracies like Ukraine and Israel in their reporting. But of course, when it comes to the latter, they don't. Now, if you're new to this show, you might think, wait, it's totally different. Occupation. In that case, listen to episode 1. Islamist terrorist groups call every government in the world that is not Islamist an occupation, including the United States. And you know who else calls a democracy an occupation? Russia. Here is what Putin said about Ukraine in his treatise about it. Quote, much of modern-day Ukraine occupies historically Russian lands. And he wrote that Russia was robbed of them. But the media has decided to take a position on one of these, calling Ukraine an independent nation, but Israel an occupying force, despite what the Palestinian Authority itself has said in writing. One more note on this. Here was a report from NPR.
Dmitry Medvedev, who's high up in the Russian government, posted a tweet laced with genocidal language about Ukraine, and that got many thousands of retweets.
What is the genocidal language they're referring to? I looked at other NPR coverage to see which things they were determining counted as genocidal language. Here are the quotes they point to. Quote, why will Ukraine disappear? Because nobody needs it. Also calling Ukraine a Nazi regime and blood-sucking parasites. Who else uses this kind of language? Saying a democratic nation must disappear. falsely calling it Nazi, calling its residents parasites. Who talks exactly like that? Hamas and Iran's many other Islamist terrorist proxies, of course. Find me anytime the media has called that genocidal. The word for what the media is doing is not journalism. It's propaganda. And speaking of that, coming up, the media specifically talks about propaganda, including from China. Yet, a leading international journalism organization just announced that lots of news outlets joined its campaign that has the exact hallmarks of propaganda.
The Russians were Russian, the Prussians. The Prussians were crushing the Russians. The Balkans were balking, and Turkey was walking, Rasputin disputing, and Italy hooting. The Bolshes all Bolsheviks. The British were watching the sea. But the good Lord, I'm thanking the Yanks started yanking, and Yank Kaiser fill up a tree.
There is a three-step dance the media uses to spread lies. In the newsletter, I break down what those three steps are so you can recognize what's happening every time you see it. It's a performance that swings public opinion and radicalizes people. That is just one of the many things you'll learn in the newsletter. It's designed to complement this show, giving you facts, sources, videos, photos, and more. Unlike the media, I don't expect you to take my word for anything. The newsletter is also where people send in their ideas and requests for topics to cover on this show. And there's another feature. Sometimes you probably hear someone say something that you know is false because you heard about it here, and you want to find where that was so you can send them a link. Well, here's how it works. When you go to the main page of the newsletter, you can type in any topic or the name of a news agency, just about anything, and it will show you where I have addressed that topic. It will bring you to the facts, which you can then share. I also have email addresses for major news sites and instructions for you to send messages to the leaders so you can let them know what they're doing wrong. The newsletter is free, but this show relies on your support, and the best way to support the show is to become a paid subscriber to the newsletter. When you do that, I reward you with exclusive content, I read messages from you on the show, and I help you save lots of money by accessing major news sites for free legally. To find the newsletter, check out the show notes or my website, joshlevs.com. You'll see a direct link. The newsletter is on a platform called Substack. If you're already on Substack, just look me up by name or by the title. They stand corrected. Thank you. Earlier, I played you a clip from NPR. Here is another part of that same segment. This was in the introduction to it.
Twitter just lifted its barriers on state media accounts for Russia, China, and Iran. NPR's Derek Kerr looked into how government propaganda is spreading as a result.
And then the reporter said this.
Now the fear is that those state media accounts can start spreading virally, and this could lead to more government propaganda and misinformation across the platform.
Oh no, we wouldn't want government propaganda to spread. Now, what is Hamas saying today? Let's read that verbatim and treat it as fact. Even when news agencies bother to give any source, they use words like Gaza Health Ministry as though somehow it's legit and trustworthy. They don't tell you that's Hamas. They do stuff like this all the time. Here's something on NPR's website from the fighting between Iran and Israel. Quote, 224 civilians have been killed in Iran, period. And in Israel, at least 24 people have been killed according to the Prime Minister's office. You hear that? No source listed for Iran, but yes, a source for Israel. Guess where that 224 figure came from? Iran government propaganda. Literally the exact same source that NPR is freaking out that Twitter is allowing to say things. Oh no, Twitter better not allow them to say this stuff, but we will provide it as though it's a fact. Oh man, this is tragicomically hilarious. There are similar examples of this everywhere. I've played clips in the past of the BBC running Hamas propaganda as fact. Hamas is backed by Iran and by Qatar, which also has its state-owned propaganda arm known as Al Jazeera. Meanwhile, the BBC likes to present itself as standing up to propaganda. Here is the BBC mentioning that former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, this horrible anti-Semite, used to do segments for Iran's Press TV, which he got paid for.
He, of course, in the past has worked for Press TV, which is the propaganda arm of the Iranian regime.
They also went after Corbyn directly over it in this interview.
Do you regret the thousands of pounds you took off the Iran state broadcaster when working for them?
I took part in some programs of Press TV. I stopped doing anything with Press TV when they dealt with the elections in Iran and the way in which they dealt with the opposition.
This is the organisation.
No, can I finish,
but
please?
I want to tell you that this is the organisation who filmed a journalist who was working for us on Iranian issues, who was tortured and imprisoned, and then filmed by Press TV in the presence of his torturer. And that material was put out, and that was at the period when you were working there.
I severed my connection because of the way they treated the opposition
But
parties
do you
in
regret
Iran.
that you ever had anything to do with them?
Every program I ever spoke on, indeed every program I ever speak on, I talk about human rights and justice.
No, he doesn't. But that is an extremely good example of what people on the far left do when challenged on this stuff. Just keep bringing up their word salad of talking points and ignoring what they're being asked about. All right, how about China? Here is the BBC on that.
CGTN, which is a propaganda channel or Chinese government channel in the UK, is also being investigated by Ofcom. There is a strong sense that various countries are using sort of state propaganda services to try and disseminate their message.
So, according to the media, propaganda is bad, except when they like it. Then it's truth. But in recent days, parts of the media did something even worse. They joined a propaganda campaign. Here's what happened. There are these two groups that organized it. One of them is a group that the media love. It's an NGO, a non-governmental organization. The media cites it all the time. It's called Reporters Without Borders. The other one is an openly political organization called Avaz. These groups announced that more than 250 news organizations joined them to simultaneously spread the same pre-written anti-Israel messages. One example is a British news site, The Independent, quote-unquote news sites, blacked out their front pages to provide these messages, according to Reporters Without Borders. That group, by the way, is known by its acronym in French, RSF. This is exactly how propaganda works, simultaneously releasing coordinated messages. And usually the media know this. Do you remember years ago when Sinclair TV stations here in the United States had their local anchors read the same right-wing message? And in every case, they were supposed to act like it was their anchors having these thoughts themselves. Big networks covered that. I'm going to play you something here. This was from a website called Deadspin. They compiled a bunch of local stations doing this at the same time. So when I play it for you, you'll hear this like cacophony of voices kind of overlapping. It's not super clear. So I'll keep this bite really short. Here's a little piece of what they put together.
Some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
CNN called what these Sinclair stations did a promotional campaign that sounds like pro-Trump propaganda. When you are coming together to take a position on something you're supposed to be covering, and you present a biased, one-sided message with no facts and no context, you are not engaging in journalism by definition. You are engaging in propaganda. Now, fortunately, most of the big news agencies refused to participate directly in this campaign from Avaz and RSF. The Guardian is big. They ran a staff editorial that was basically this group's talking points. But did any of the big news agencies report about this and call it what it was, propaganda? Did any of them point out that an organization representing journalists should never, ever do this? There are some good write-ups about this from organizations called Honest Reporting and Camera. Camera wrote, imagine the reaction if Western media outlets participated in a campaign for Hamas to release the hostages in Gaza, which included suggesting talking points, and that was launched and coordinated by a group like theirs. That, of course, is unthinkable. And yet it's exactly what happened here, just on the other side. So here's what's clear. News agencies happily call out propaganda they don't like, while happily echoing propaganda they want you to believe. Some openly take part in propaganda, and the rest refuse to call it out. More on this coming up.
The propaganda ministry, oh, they do it so well. They make me feel like I'm under their magic spell. Oh, it's a propaganda parade, where the truth is always twisted and swayed.
An episode of this show about the national debt got so many reactions. And it's no surprise. In a recent survey, more than half of Americans said they care a lot about the national debt, now over $37 trillion. For comparison, that's bigger than the entire U.S. economy. A figure generally used to estimate the size of the economy is our GDP, gross domestic product. The debt is way bigger than that. And we, the taxpayers, pay interest on it. Want to guess how much we paid in interest last year alone? $882 billion. Anyway, as I always say on this show, don't worry about the numbers. If you want them, you can get them in my newsletter. This is just to give you the big picture. But it's not just that we pay taxes to cover the interest on the debt, much of which is owned by other countries. The debt also increases prices on just about everything. It spurs inflation. A lot of people want to do something about this. If you are one of them, then there's something you can do in literally 30 seconds. I did, and I recommend it. There's a petition about this. It's very simple. It's literally just 4 brief sentences. Unless you count the part where it says add your name if you agree, then technically it's 5. Anyway, I have seen petitions that work, that get the attention of our leaders, that make a difference. I believe this one can. To find it, visit the show notes or my newsletter. You'll see why it helps this show, too. Let's take action together. Thanks. As I record this, Palestinian Islamist terrorists slaughtered people at a bus stop and on a bus in Jerusalem. An Arab nation wasted no time in condemning this as what it was, an act of terrorism. The United Arab Emirates said it, quote, condemned in the strongest terms the terrorist shooting. It also said it condemns all forms of violence and terrorism aimed at undermining security and stability. It expressed condolences and sympathy to the families of the victims and to the State of Israel and its people, as well as its wishes for a speedy recovery for all the injured. So, an Arab nation had no problem calling this what it is. Terrorism, because it was all about purposely killing civilians. But you know what entity refuses to call it terrorism? The mainstream media. The biggest news agencies are, as always, avoiding the term terrorism when it comes to killing people of Israel. In an early episode of this show, I explained how this works. News organizations claim to have rules about this. They say they only report that government officials are calling things terrorism. They attribute it. They say they don't call things terrorism themselves. That is a lie. Here are just some of the headlines from just the past year alone. 6 years after kidnapping, she escaped terrorists. That's a headline from the New York Times reporting about Nigeria. There are no quotes in that headline. There's no attribution. It is the Times saying these folks in Nigeria are terrorists. Here's the Washington Post. At the trial of the Paris terrorists coming to terms with a city's pain. See, according to the media, it is definitively terrorism when it happens in France or Nigeria. Here's the wire service, UPI. They wrote, Britain marks 20th anniversary of deadly 7/7 terror attack in London. And the Associated Press, quote, postponed Sugar Bowl played with enhanced security about 36 hours after terror attack in New Orleans. All of these were attacks by Islamist terrorists. All of these news agencies claim they don't do this. This is the norm for today's media. They not only report propaganda, they reinforce propagandistic thinking by applying different rules to different places based on how they feel about a place. Where do they get their cues about how to feel? Activists, propagandists. We can end this together. The key is to launch a truth counter movement, to realign so that we come together, putting facts first always. That's what this show is all about. It's why your support means everything. Anything you do to support this show makes a huge difference. Getting the newsletter, becoming a paid subscriber, making a contribution through PayPal, sponsoring an episode, telling friends about this show, sending them a specific episode and saying, I really think you should listen to this one. All of these things help grow a truth counter movement, which we so desperately need. To all of you taking those steps, thank you. Let's grow this together. As always, I would love to hear from you with your feedback, questions, things you want me to fact check, links, all this stuff. There are 2 great ways to reach me. The best is the newsletter, and the second is a form at my website. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.